To talk about a really rare paper of Robin that nobody knows, I mean, that I did one. I will tell you how I met Robin and how we were working in that. I met Robin in 85, 86. I was having some working holidays here in what we used to be called ABRO, the preceding organization to Roslin. I was sharing a desk with Brian McQuirk. And I was a young lecturer at that time, and I went here, in Spain. At that time, we learned in the secondary school French, because nobody thought that English language was relevant. So, I mean, I had to learn English when I was 22. I came here with about 15 words of English, using all of them in the wrong order. Now I have about 150, still using them in the wrong order. But at that time, I went here and I started working with Robin, and I said, well, I do not understand him. It's probably because of my English, and I was putting pressure in my English, but I discovered that it was not the reason. So we managed, that with Chris Haley, Sarah Knotts, and Robin, we managed that we will come to Edinburgh, my team here, sometimes, and sometimes they will come to Valencia, and we did that with several years, with the main purpose of enjoying ourselves. That, as you know, is the main purpose of life, but also of analyzing some data of pigs here in Edinburgh and rabbits in Valencia, and among them, we were analyzing the data of the elliptical selection experiment that I will comment now to you. Well, I mean, once upon a time, there were the so-called selection experiments. You young people do not know that, but in the past, we used to have selection experiments, and we were analyzing that, finding genetic parameters and things like this, And these experiments started normally by estimating the genetic, you wouldn't believe me, the young people, but they were starting by estimating the genetic parameters before starting the selection, processes. And we had the problem and the question, which is the most efficient design for estimating the genetic parameters. So, I do not know whether this is explained now in the agricultural schools, or you only learn genomics now. But in the old time, we were saying that if you have a heritability and you want to have a short interval of confidence, you were selecting the extremes of the parents, and you were checking the offsprings of them, and you were fitting the offspring-parent regression, with a much better confidence interval than if you were using them, all of them and so on. So the point is, what happens when you have two traits, for example, you have two heritabilities and a genetic correlation. It's not obvious what you should do in that case, And several solutions, were proposed. For example, there is a solution that is, well, take trait A and trait B and do the same. If that worked for one parameter, that should work for two, and for the correlation. Well, it's not obvious that this is going to work in the case of three parameters, but it was an idea, The other thing is that, well, use an index with economic weights. For example, you have an index for traits A and B, and we have another index for traits A and B with different economic weights. Which economic weights? We don't know. I mean, there are some experiments in which they say, well, one plus the other and one minus the other with standardized traits, But it's not obvious either, whether this is the best method or not, and the problem is complex because we do not know exactly what do we mean for being efficient when we have three parameters. And Robin had an idea and say, well, if we have this for one trait, we can have that for two traits, Just take the multivariate density function, and instead of selecting the extremes of a normal, we select the extremes of this function. Of course, this is not in the Robin's paper. It would be too easy to understand the Robin's paper, by having that, But the idea was not bad. In Robin's paper, what you have is that you have to select. Well, the idea is to select. I mean, if you look at that from the top, you have ellipses. And the idea is to select outside of some of the ellipses, one of them, The idea, by the way, was proposed before by Tallis, in the context of keeping a control population with the moments, in selecting inside of the ellipse. But the idea here is selecting outside of the ellipse, So the idea is that, which is in the Robbins paper, you have a quadratic index, and you select the animals that are out of, some of the borders. You have a selection pressure which is related to this ellipse, and the idea is how to maximize the efficiency of the whole process and to prove that this is the best method. And most of the paper is dedicated to prove that this is the best method, and is the difficult part of the paper. I did, that there is a very difficult paper written by Fisher in 1918, the fundamental paper of quantitative genetics that nobody understands. And we are having in October in Edinburgh to have a meeting on the paper that is so important and that nobody understands. So, and there's been published an explanation of this paper by Moran and Smith that is commenting the paper paragraph by paragraph. I did the same with Robbins' paper, and I published in Spanish, a complete description of Robbins' paper, Cameron and Thompson paper, explaining everything on that, with a difference. The explanation of Moran and Smith of the Fisher paper is more confusing than the Fisher paper. But in my case, I think that I was successful with that. But if you are linguistically handicapped and you cannot read Spanish, I suggest you to go to the original paper of Robin and find, the errata and things like that the paper has. It's a difficult paper, if you are not running with that. But the idea is quite simple and quite attractive. And they proved, really, that was the most efficient method. What does it mean, the most efficient method? It's clear that for one parameter to minimize the confidence interval, so for several parameters, one criterion can be to minimize the volume of the ellipsoid. It's the same, but with more dimensions. And, well, it's not so easy to calculate this. But, I suppose that when you have three traits, you can be more interested in one trait than in the other because it has more economical relevance or whatever, and you would like to have a better confidence interval in this trait, even if you have a poorer in the other trait or whatever. But it's complicated, to deal with that, and a general criterion could be to minimize the volume of the ellipsoid. These two ellipsoids, by the way, have the same volume, so it's not really a trivial question. The optimality was demonstrated when traits measured in one sex, the estimation via regression side offspring, and supposing that the phenotypic variances were estimating without error. There is another question, which is that whether we use a phenotypic ellipse or a genetic ellipse. The idea of the phenotypic ellipse instead of a genetic ellipse is that imagine that you have a trait in which you have the genetic correlations are different from the environmental correlations. So, it's not obvious that the phenotypic ellipse should be used, but in practice it's quite robust. You change the phenotypic ellipse and that more or less works, So can we improve elliptic selection? Well, we can measure traits in more than one sex. We can do assortative mating, which is a way of improving all of these type of designs, mating close points as all the ellipse. And we can use an optimal selection pressure. The problem with the optimal selection pressure is that it depends on the true parameters. So if you know the true parameters, you do not need to perform elliptic selection. So, we do not know exactly how to deal with that, but Robin demonstrated that for a wide range of values, a pressure about 20%, which means selecting the best 20% animals, works pretty well in many circumstances. And of course, you can use more than two traits. If we use more than two traits, we have an ellipsoid selection, And by the way, some of the animals that can be selected in ellipsoid selection wouldn't be selected in elliptic selection. So it's not exactly the same method, but it's a generalization that can be used. Well, elliptic selection has been applied in rabbits, which is very interesting. Why rabbits? In my discussions with Bill Hill, I always say that experiments can be still performed in animal breeding because rabbits make money. We kill about 50 million rabbits per year in Spain. About half of them come from our nucleuses, and nucleuses linked to my university. So rabbits maintain themselves. The experiments are self-paid by the rabbits. Who do you think that are paying me my stay here now? Not the organization, of course, the rabbits. And rabbit, well, it's a good model, has a short generation interval, ovulation is induced by coitus, which would be horrible in humans, but in rabbits have the advantages that you know exactly what happens, when you, the embryos, when you recover embryos, you know which are the age. The carcasses are cheap, so we can make mixed quality studies that with mice you can't, and they are easy to manage, to manage pigs and cows for operations really is a mess, but the rabbit is bigger than a rat, and smaller than a pig. So it has the optimal, size, for making experiments with it. They are quite useful, And Robin has published on elliptic selection with rabbits. There is a paper of Robin publishing estimating genetic parameters, with elliptic selection in rabbits. There is another paper on elliptic selection, and as far as I know, there are the only 2 papers in the world published on elliptic selection. So, I have a complete list of references here. No, have you published in elliptic selection as well? Oh, great. It's so nice to know that I wasn't the only one that was involved in that. But, well, in fact, Robin explained, elliptic selection. I have a film of Robin explaining elliptic selection with rabbits, and he was, as you know, properly dressed for the occasion. This is the moment in which Robin was talking. Do you see the ellipse here? and the rabbits? And by the way, all of these photos, with Robin dressing that, is when he was promoted to a honorary doctorate in the Valencia University, and are the proper clothes for being a doctor. I have the similar clothes for being a doctor. All we have this type of clothes. For I do not know. You perhaps have simpler clothes, or have this kind of proper hats, or so this is. I will show you, I put that as an example of how elliptical selection works, because these stylized figures that you draw when you're, just putting the elliptic selection examples, are not as nice as in the reality, But I'm not going to give you the genetic parameters, because I do not think that we are particularly interested in knowing which is the heritability of food conversion rate in rabbits. So, but before finishing, I would like to say that Robin has been invested Doctor Honoris Causa at the University of Valencia years ago. So we recognized his merits before. This is one of the things. The second thing that I would like to say is that this is the building of my institute, It's been made with European funds, so essentially with your taxes. So, well, you can see how well we employ your taxes. So, it's not really, now in the future will be different probably, but we employ that. But this is the entry of my institute, And in the entry of my institute, we are in a street, This is the street. Which street? This street, if you write, in the old times, there was a thing called post office, and we write things, put in envelopes, and send that by post. No, it was not, like electronic mail and so. If you would like to send me a letter or whatever, you have to do that in the Carrer Robin Thompson. So it's Robin Thompson Street. Carrer means street in Catalan, which is our language, our local language. So I still think that you still can honor it, Robin, by dedicating him. I saw that you do not have streets here, but you can use a corridor, or you can, or some steps. Or even better, if you have a local pub, I think it would be, he will probably appreciate, that something has his name, but, that for writing a letter to me, you have to put Carrer Robin Thompson in Valencia. And that's it, thanks.